Hello everyone, this is John Farrell with GamingTrend.com. I'm doing my first video review of the Expanse board game. First, I should probably give you a little introduction into what exactly the Expanse is, in case you don't already know. It is a series of books and a television show, and both are really high quality. They're excellent material that I recommend you check out. They take place in a hard sci-fi universe. Things are realistic and things are political. This is a place where there are two major superpowers, that being Earth and Mars, that are at sort of a Cold War détente with one another, while corporations are trying to take over and the lower classes who have been marginalized are slowly radicalizing. I wonder what that's like. The Expanse board game takes on these design elements pretty directly. The game is about dominance militarily, economically, and in terms of political power. So what you'll be doing during the game is taking on one of the major factions, whether it's the Earth government, the Mars government, Protogen, which is a major corporation that has stake in the universe because of how powerful it has become, or the OPA, which is a collection of miners and dock workers, well, space docks, who, because of their presence in the asteroid belt, which is where Earth mines much of its water and precious minerals, are really people who have a lot to lose and have grown some power of their own over those minerals, so they're trying to get a foothold in the galaxy. Now this game, it being sort of a war game, area control, with political factions based in the Cold War, might remind you of Twilight Struggle, and that is on purpose. They're trying to evoke a lot of that sense of dark, paranoid politics that's going on, and they're trying to be similar in terms of gameplay, where you're acting with action cards, trying to take over areas. But in my opinion, it has a few benefits. For one thing, Twilight Struggle is a two-player game that lasts around 3 hours. The Expanse, on the other hand, can go from 2 to 4 players, and even at the maximum with 4 players, I'd say is not that much longer than an hour. And with 2 people, it actually can take longer because you're taking longer to make decisions. It's a little more chess-like. It sometimes can run shorter than an hour. But before I really get into the rules, I want you to take a look at this thing and understand with me what it is that you get when you open the box. There are a few things that the Expanse gets right out of the gate. For one, the darkness that's all over the board, the cards, and the cover lets you know that this is a universe that takes place in a hard sci-fi galaxy. This older, industrial-looking spacecraft feels realistic, and the emptiness of space in front of you helps foment that feeling of paranoia that the game is really about. Each of the cards and the different factions are appreciatingly well colored. They range from red to white to blue to a darker gray. And that means that if you're colorblind, I don't think you should have any problem with this game. Most colorblindnesses won't, as I understand it. If I'm wrong, I would actually appreciate someone in the comments correcting me on that, because I want to make sure that I comment on that when I see it, and I'm not always able to do so. Now, as you can see from the board and some of the cards, it's easy to get some information right out the gate. Just as you're looking at the board right now, areas are clearly delineated, and it's easy to tell where certain cubes are on them, the cubes representing influence points. You also have fleets, which will drop those off, but I'll explain the rules a little bit later. The cards, which contain necessary information, at a glance from far away, you can tell some important information, which factions can use them, how many action points they allow, and you may not tell it because of the resolution of this camera, but the effects that they have if you use their events are also pretty easy to tell from across the table, and if necessary, someone can hand you the card. The one exception are scoring cards, which are because they have several steps that are important, but you'll get those down pretty quickly. Now, much like the Battlestar Galactica board game, also based on a sci-fi series on the Sci-Fi Network, this uses art from the show itself, but it never feels out of place. For one, they stick to the proper sense of lighting. Things are dark, and this is not a friendly universe. It's a dark one, and it's one with real people with real things at stake. They chose the pictures well. They aren't random action shots. They're quick, dramatic moments and impactful things that help you understand what exactly is going on and keep you in the experience. Everything is very consistent in terms of tone, which is incredibly important for a game that is about building such a succinct experience here. So what you're trying to do in this game is gain as much influence as possible for your faction in the various locations. The board is split up into different sectors, first of all, between the inner planets around Earth, the asteroid belt, and outer planets, which are mostly inaccessible gas giants. Each of those will have different orbitals, which are essentially the area around which their gravity has effect, and within those, different locations. So for instance, Jupiter has an orbital which contains its moons Europa, Ganymede, and Io, and each of those are different locations you can try to gain influence over. The more influence you have in different areas, the more points that you'll get during scoring. That's not the only important part, though. Certain locations, Europa for example, will have certain special resources. Europa has a lot of water because it's an ice moon. It's essentially a big ball of ice. And each different faction has resources that it's looking out for which can grant it extra points. If you're from the asteroid belt, because you're not actually on a planet, you have more trouble getting water. So you get more points for your faction if you're able to gather more water. Now, something I appreciate about this game is how easy it is to get up and running with this, not only in terms of setup, but actually playing the game. The back of each card has the setup for it. Each card being each faction card. It just says you put down this many fleets, this many influence, and you're pretty much ready to go. The simplified rules that they provide for you really are all you need to play the game. There are only a few things you might have to check out, and even then, it's unlikely. And these simplified rules only take a few minutes to read through and learn. So in the space of, I'd honestly say 5 minutes, you can understand how to play this game and teach it to other people. And that's impressive for something that has this much strategic depth. So what are you actually doing on your turn? That is actually fairly simple. There are two major choices that you make, and one of them you might actually ignore. The first thing you do is you look at a track of cards which contains the action cards that I showed you earlier. Each of those can be more expensive given how far away they are from the front. So the first card costs 0, then 1, 1, and then 2 and 2 control points, which are your victory points. So if there's a card that you want more, you can get it earlier, but you're directly trading down your influence over the galaxy. And those cards are incredibly important because of the effects they have. Each card has an action point allowance on it as well as an event that you can play. And what you choose when you get a card is whether you're going to use it for its action points or for its event. And the action points are very important because of what they allow you to do. You can, with action points, move a fleet or a group of fleets from one orbital to another. Fleets are incredibly important because they are how you drop off influence. You can place a fleet in your home orbital, which is fairly obvious. For Earth it's Earth, for Mars it's Mars, and so forth. And you can also add influence to a base where you have an orbital. And you'd think that these actions would make it an obvious choice. Why would you not just do that? They're simple, quick ways to gain influence and move around the board. The reason is because of how powerful these effects are that you get when you use an event. Now, each event can only be used by certain factions, so you'll have to decide when you look at a card, maybe you want to get rid of it just so that an opponent can't use it. Maybe you have to look around and see who else might want to use that for their purposes, because some of these events really can be powerful. They can be dropping influence somewhere randomly on a board, removing someone else's influence tokens, moving fleets around quickly. There are a lot of different effects that they have, and it can be a real nail-biter with a more powerful card that will have more action points to decide whether you want to use the effect or go for the wide array of moves that it would give you that are more conventional. And it's a simple choice like that, where just by hearing me talk about that, you pretty much understand how it goes, and there are so many different choices within that. The one difference, and this is very important, is that you can choose to save an event for later. Instead of playing it now, you can get the card, lose a control point, and you'll be able to play it at a later time and hold it in reserve. And one of the reasons that is important is because of something else you can do. You may not want to use that event now, or you may not want to use it at all. However, if you use a card for its action points, the other players down the line have the opportunity to use the event if they're of the correct faction. Doing so drops them down lower on the initiative track. It puts them at the bottom, which gives you another interesting choice. Maybe actually give someone an important event to goad them into getting lower on the initiative if you have a bigger plan. And now I like, with just a couple of simple rules, they're giving you some complex choices so you can decide how you want to manipulate the other people at the table. As a game that's designed to be a complex political power play, I think it's pretty masterful. But I want to also get into the scoring, because that ties a lot into how you're going to be making these choices. So let's jump back into the board to show you how that works. Hidden within the action deck are 6 scoring cards, which are incredibly important. The first thing that you will do if you successfully claim one of these cards is choose which of the sectors will secretly grant extra points during the scoring round. Before you do that, anyone who has an event saved up can choose to use it, and then whoever has the lowest number of control points at that time takes control of the Rosinante. The ship from the series, it's a powerful Martian warship that's been co-opted by our dutiful and rugged and terrible decision-making main characters. It has some special abilities, and it's a simple catch-up mechanic, but it's useful because of how powerful it is. Then you will score locations based on the number of influence that you have on them, gaining extra points for whichever the bonus one is. And then each faction will gain a different faction tech. Now, this only happens with the latter 3 scoring cards. So after 3 scoring cards have come out, people will begin gaining special abilities. Each faction begins with a special ability, which is pretty unique and pretty thematic given how these factions work within the lore. But these faction cards help to ramp things up near the end of the game. Now, the one issue I have with them is that there are only 3 per faction and you gain them in order. So there's not much variation. Once you know how a faction works, you can pretty much anticipate what they're going to be doing. With something like the proto-molecule, which is essentially a giant bomb, there's not much reason for someone who's a member of Protogen not to use that very soon after he gets it. Also, each faction, their second ability out of 3 is the same, Open Warfare. 2 action points to remove a fleet where you have a fleet. This is the only direct combat in the game, and it's reasonably powerful, but it underscores the fact that this game is not really about direct combat. It's about diplomacy, it's about maneuvering. If you like combat in your area control, something like Comet, or however that's supposed to be pronounced, there's an Egyptian argument in there, you might not appreciate this. This is much more indirect. Once the 6th scoring card is revealed, the game is over. Now, be careful. Not once the 6th scoring card is played by someone. It's once it's flipped up on the table. So once the 5th one comes out, you know the ending is somewhere in the deck, but not where it is. It can be a little bit of an issue because you want to be careful about maybe trying to stack the deck a little bit so that they don't come out one after another. I had a game once, and maybe this is me doing something wrong, where we didn't get that far through the deck before we got through all of the scoring cards. It's possible there's a rule in there to prevent that, and I just didn't see it. So I'm not really going to count that against the game, especially because it adds a lot of variety. And you have a good way to keep track. As the game's going on, you can see maybe this is going to be a quicker one. We've gotten through 3 or so scoring cards and we're not halfway through the deck, so we need to start ramping up and being careful. In terms of variety, it suffers a bit because, again, the powers are kind of limited. There are only a few upgrades that you can get, and you know what they are. However, I think it scales well regardless of whether or not you know the game or how many players you're using. It's a slightly different game if you're going from 2 to 3 to 4 because the area becomes more cluttered. In 2 players, you might start far away from one another and you're really not focusing on interacting, you're just gaining influence, and right at the end you're starting to come into conflict over a few key areas. However, If you've got 3 or 4 players, you're more likely to want to need to be aggressive earlier on and deal with threats as soon as you can. The indirect combat means that you can only really do that through the warfare action or certain cards which let you remove enemy influences or move fleets around, but I think whether or not that's a problem is really more a matter of taste. In terms of final thoughts, I am a really big fan of this game. I think it moves along quickly, it translates its themes excellently, it teaches you how to play very quickly, and yet I can see myself playing this game for years, trying to slowly maneuver around how people are thinking, whether or not they're trying to fake me out, the events that they choose to keep, the events that I choose to give them with action points. It's a couple of simple mechanics that really lead to an incredible amount of depth. Also, as a fan of the book series and the television series, I think it's fairly loyal. It captures that feeling of being dark and alone in a universe where there are powerful factions controlling millions of lives, if not more. I really recommend this game. Not only is it something that you can scale well with a lot of people, teach them easily, and get a ton of fun out of, it's also, for an area control game, pretty cheap. Partially that's because they use little wooden cubes instead of fancy Greek miniatures or something like that. Again, I think that's a little more a matter of choice, but it keeps the price point down. It makes people able to play this game, and I personally recommend it. This is my first video review, so I'd appreciate any thoughts you have about how it can improve, anything that you might have wanted to see out of this game or out of my reviews in the past, but also this game in particular. Twilight Struggle is incredibly popular, at least if you believe the weird, skewed Board Game Geek metrics, which I don't think you should take at face value, but either way, it has a pretty big influence. I think the idea of trying to scale it down, make it more accessible, get more people into it, and give them something which is science fiction instead of the Cold War, which we know a little bit better because it exists, is actually a really good idea, and it's a great way to get people into the game. But I want to hear your thoughts, and I will respond to them if at all possible. Until then, I am John Farrell with GamingTrend.com, signing off.